Hello, and welcome to the Health Go Live webinar series. Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at Ropes and Gray. We would like to remind you that the chat feature is available, so feel free to send in your questions for the panel throughout the discussion. Our speakers would love to hear from you. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator, Kelly Combs.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kelly Combs. I'm a partner in the Ropes and Gray FDA regulatory practice and also co-chair of our digital health initiative. And I'm based in Washington, D.C. Today, we'll be talking about the digital health regulatory frontier, and I'm thrilled to have two of my partners here to join in the discussion. Dr. Lincoln Sang is the head of our European life sciences practice based in London. And Catherine Wang is a China life sciences expert based in Asia. Today, we'll be focused on digital health regulatory trends in our various jurisdictions, as well as efforts to harmonize regulatory efforts around the world. We'll be focusing on a number of topics, starting with real-world evidence, then moving on to talk about secondary use of data, and then finally rounding out the discussion today with a topic of artificial intelligence and machine learning in digital health technology, medical devices, and so on. So as we kick off this morning, let's start with Catherine in a discussion of real-world evidence. Catherine, can you just describe for us real-world evidence, please?
Thank you, Kelly. And good morning, everyone. The notion of real-world evidence basically is real-world data that is considered reliable and relevant to the clinical question at issue. So essentially, it is the type of evidence that will be used to prove a product is safe and effective. The source of real-world evidence actually generally comes from real-world data. And real-world data is generated typically from the daily routine delivery of healthcare and patient health conditions. And there are various sources of such data, which could be the hospital's information system, product registry, or patient self-reported issues. And those actually would form the source of real-world data. Real-world data is generally considered complementary to data generated from randomized controlled trials. And in many regulatory authorities, regulatory, I would say, paradigm, it was not considered as the gold standard, but it's actually very helpful and informative because the type of randomized controlled trials usually are not designed to be very consistent with how products would be used in clinics. So it is more and more important for regulatory authorities to consider real-world data in their regulatory approval process.
Thanks, Catherine. And I know you were talking and will continue to talk today about some distinctions between real-world data and real-world evidence and traditional clinical trial data. And with those distinctions, I think, come a number of challenges that will inform our discussion today, including, significant variability in data sources, right? We're getting real-world data and generating real-world evidence from things like electronic health records and wearables and prescription claims databases and other sorts of information where there just tends to be a lot of variability in how the information is collected, whether it's collected at an academic medical center or from a local healthcare provider, but also variability depending on country of origin and standard of care that may vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, as well as different terminology that can be used. When we think about traditional clinical trials, obviously there are a lot of controls in place to mitigate the risk of bias. And I know that's something that a lot of regulators have been focusing on and companies have been focusing on as we think about the best ways to really leverage real-world data. Lincoln, I want to come back to you. I want to start with you and talk about how real-world evidence is being used by relevant regulators in your jurisdiction.
I think the starting point, I think that Catherine has alluded to, I think that there's a great deal of debate and attention being paid to the legitimate use of real-world evidence. And it has becoming particularly apparent with the emergence over the last 30 years of what is now known to be rules and levels of evidence. And you mentioned about the use of RCT as a gold standard. It's just a simple label to say that it is a kind of method methodology that will generate type data that will the regulators and decision-making makers can rely comfortably on the deciding whether or not a drug or intervention will provide the type of confidence to inform the risk-benefit assessment. But I think that is not the way that we're approaching things nowadays, because ultimately, for the current debate, is about the type of evidence that we can comfortably rely upon, irrespective of source, to make a broader assessment as to whether or not an intervention can be used in clinical practice. That is the current debate, is the convergency of benefit risk and the clinical utility of a drug. So therefore, one will have to look at a diversity of data sources in order to generate the type of evidence we need. Now, you mentioned about the RCT. I think RCT has always been considered the gold standard, but at the same time, I think that there are limitations associated with RCT. There are a number of troubling features, including the reliance on null hypothesis, probability, generalizability, which you mentioned, and the resource implications. And experiment, observation, and mathematics individually and collectively, which underpin what we are talking about today, have a crucial role to play in providing the evidential basis for modern therapeutics. The arguments about relative importance, RCT versus real-world evidence, is probably a necessary distraction. And also the hierarchical structure of randomized controlled study data and real-world evidence is probably quite irrelevant. The current approach is about whether or not we can actually utilize observational study, the benefit of observational study based on real-world evidence, and addressing some of the issues you mentioned about bias. For example, confounding by limit indication and prognostic incomparability kind of parameter which contribute towards bias can be managed and eliminated in a pragmatic trial design, prospectively designed to generate a type of evidence that regulators as well as payers increasingly, when deciding cost effectiveness, can rely upon in making a decision as to whether or not the drug does or does not work in clinical practice.
Thanks, Lincoln. And coming back to you, Catherine, can you talk a little bit about recent efforts in China and how Chinese regulators are viewing real-world evidence?
Yeah, so the NMPA in China has actually rolled out a series of technical review guidelines, both in the drug and also in the device space, to consider using real-world evidence as input in the product review and approval process. So for example, the most earlier versions of the technical review guidelines actually talk about the use of real-world evidence and how they can complement the use of data from randomized controlled trials. And then recently, the CDE in China also rolled out technical review guidelines on the design of the real-world studies. So this actually helped companies design the studies more consistently. And they also roll out protocols to help companies schedule consultation meetings with the CDE if they want to use real-world studies and real-world data in addition to the clinical trial data they have generated overseas to secure marketing authorizations in China. And similarly, there are also technical review guidelines that were issued by the Center for Medical Device Evaluation this year that talks about the use of real-world evidence and the statistical analysis of such evidence in product marketing authorization applications. So I can see that actually the NMPA in China has been very keen to figure out what's the best way of introducing real-world evidence in the approval process.
Thanks, Catherine. And I think for our part here in the US, we're seeing real-world evidence used in a variety of ways. So certainly increasing use to support regulatory submissions. Also, of course, for conducting post-market surveillance to support coverage and reimbursement decisions, as well as just to promote or educate healthcare professionals or patients or payers or others on the cost and value associated with particular products. And FDA seems to be increasingly comfortable with the use of real-world evidence. There was a law passed in 2016 called the 21st Century Cures Act that has required the agency to issue a variety of guidance documents to really further the use of real-world evidence. At this point, real-world evidence is more common in medical device approvals as opposed to drug approvals, but we are seeing uptick on the drug side as well, especially in rare disease, oncology, pediatric indications, and so on. There have been probably half a dozen guidances issued in the US over the last couple of years. Most recently, at the end of the summer, FDA issued a guidance related to considerations for the use of real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making that, among other things, provides recommendation for data access and safety monitoring. And this guidance builds off a bunch of high-level principles that had been in development at FDA for a long time. And if we look at the guidances in the US on the whole, that's what they're really laying out is kind of high-level principles. So not a lot of operational or detailed guidance yet to think through things like fit for purpose and relevance and reliability. It's all been pretty high level, but I think the key takeaway from the FDA side is that the agency has certainly gone on the record to say that real-world evidence can theoretically support approval for drugs and devices, but that you need to be consulting with the agency early and often to make sure that your use of real-world evidence is really aligned with FDA's expectations. So we've talked a little bit about where we've been with respect to real-world evidence. So let's now move on and talk about where we might be going. And Lincoln, I'll start with you. What's on the horizon from a regulatory perspective?
Well, I think that in the horizon on this side of the pond is really the European agency is driving forward the circumstances in which real-world evidence can be utilized as supplementary evidence to support either pre-approval or post-approval measures, i.e. to inform the benefit risk assessment or to inform an assessment on the safety. We have a lot of experience in doing that. And there is a project called Darwin Project currently being propelled by the European agency to look at pilot studies about the utility of real-world evidence and whether or not one can actually have sort of databases within Europe which can rely upon where the data and source data are sufficiently robust that the users can access to make an informed assessment on issues such as orphan drug designation in terms of prevalence of diseases or maintenance, because that is a very important aspect in the European system, unlike in America, that the orphan designation at the beginning of the product life cycle will have to be maintained at the time when the authorization is granted. Clinical management and standard of care, diagnosis, use, and treatment patterns, that goes to the very heart of the clinical effectiveness for the purpose of market access in various jurisdictions within the European Union. Drug utilization, be it on or off label, because that goes to the very heart on monitoring the pharmacovigilance activities of a drug, the amount and duration exposure of the medicine, which is a key parameter which have been well trodden at the WHO level to inform, for example, drug intake, and that will have a significant bearing on the drug budget allocation. Product switch, effectiveness and the safety studies, for example, the association, take the example, we have gone through that era of the association of COVID-19 vaccine and occurrence of thrombosis for certain COVID-19 vaccine, and how you're going to contextualize the incidents we have seen in relation to thrombosis occurrence and the thrombocytopenia syndrome associated with certain vaccine, and whether or not that is a clinically relevant issue. So there's a lot of activities going on this side of the pond, and also internationally as well.
Thanks, Lincoln. What about you, Catherine?
Yeah, as I said just now, I think the Chinese NMPA is very enthusiastic to position or prioritize real-world evidence as a key area for the reform of its regulatory science. So in addition to using the real-world evidence for product review and approval, they also wanted to explore the use of real-world evidence for the decision on label extension or post-approval surveillance, and also potentially for use in pricing and reimbursement discussions. But most importantly and notably, I think, is the early access program that was established by the Chinese government in a couple of pilot areas. One is in the Hainan pilot zone, and the other is in the Greater Bay Area, which includes Guangdong province, Hong Kong, and Macau. In both pilot areas, the government actually made it very explicitly that they encourage companies to introduce products that are approved outside of China, but not yet in China if they are urgently needed in clinics for patient access, and use the data that were basically generated through the use of such unapproved products in the pilot areas for seeking regulatory approval nationwide. And those data potentially could be used for the approval of orphan drugs or traditional Chinese medicines or other products that are urgently needed in the clinics. So I have already seen close to like 10 successful precedents, both involving drugs and medical devices, that were approved based on real-world data generated in the pilot areas in the past few years. And I think the local government in those pilot areas has been forming research projects with NMPA and companies, trying to establish a more well-informed framework for regulators to take advantage of real-world evidence. So overall, I think the prospect of using real-world evidence in the regulatory process will be even more promising.
Thanks, Catherine. And I'll just touch on a few developments in the US and globally as well. I've mentioned that we have seen a number of guidance documents and policy statements, and also a lot of approval precedents from FDA, both on the drug side and on the device side in recent years. If we look at the guidance agenda coming out from the drug and device centers in the US, there are a number of guidances on the horizon for next year related to real-world data and real-world evidence, including an updated guidance on regulatory decision-making for medical devices that incorporate real-world evidence. So I think that's something we're certainly looking forward to. FDA also recently initiated a pilot program called the Advancing Real-World Evidence Pilot Program, which is an optional pathway for sponsors submitting real-world evidence proposals that allows kind of intensive collaboration with the agency. And the goal is to support labeling expansions or to meet post-approval study requirements, really in a way to facilitate consistency, among different therapeutic areas, and for sponsors to learn essentially from FDA and each other throughout the process. There's certainly a lot we could talk about with respect to harmonization. I know that there have been a lot of public workshops and meetings, between regulators over the last few years. Just one, I think I'll touch on briefly, is that the ICH over the summer put out what they called a reflection paper related to real-world evidence. And in that reflection paper, ICH was recommending what they call a stepwise approach to harmonizing the use of real-world data and real-world evidence across jurisdictions. And if you look at that paper, it lays out, I think, a lot of common problems, right? Including the fact that there aren't common operational definitions. Different jurisdictions and regulators are using different terminologies when it comes to describing real-world evidence. And the goal is to essentially adopt more consistent terminology, which will then, kind of further the adoption of principles for assessment, best practices for registration of study protocols, and so on. The comment period for that reflection paper just ended, and ICH is hoping to issue a final paper next summer. So that's certainly something we'll be looking out for. Lincoln, I want to turn it over to you to talk about our last topic in the real-world evidence space, and that is collaborations. So a lot of our clients, a lot of folks in industry are collaborating. We're talking about pharma, biotech collaborations, medical device collaborations, data companies, tech. Are there issues that parties should be keeping top of mind as they enter collaborations to facilitate the development and use of real-world evidence?
I think the whole idea of using real-world evidence is about putting patients and healthcare system at the center of your development and plan. Yes, collaboration, engagement with healthcare professionals, particularly important and crucial for generating real-world evidence. And many international collaborative initiatives recognize the need for collaboration to promote global knowledge. You highlighted the ICH initiative, but obviously, I think last year, I think that International Coalition of Medicines Regulators actually issue a position statement about the type of things that you mentioned under the ICH process on harmonization of terminology. That kind of international engagement and international collaboration is very, very important to promote a global knowledge, exchange of scientific ideas on the utility of real-world evidence collected in routine clinical practice from various sources in order to generate the type of evidence that will be of sufficient cogency and strength to inform decision making. The central issues here are not about data collection per se, but the study designs and the methodologies we're going to adopt in order to conduct and interpret the data. So the traditional frequentist approach to look at the statistical significance probably will have to be adapted in such a way that we'll have to take a more Bayesian approach to look at prior knowledge about the probability of a drug performance in order to inform the subsequent studies as part of the continuum of drug development program.
Thanks, Lincoln. And with that, let's move on to the next topic. It's certainly the case when we're thinking about digital health technology that so many of these issues are interrelated, right? And it feels almost impossible to have a meaningful discussion about real-world evidence without also talking about secondary use of health data. So that's what I'd like to talk about now. And Lincoln, I'll come back to you. If you can just describe for us what you think the key benefits are of permitting the secondary use of health data and some of the issues that come up in that space.
I think that we have already debated and discussed why the secondary use, because it's a derivative of what we talk about in the real-world evidence. It is a very rich and diverse source of data that we can utilize to inform, for example, linkage analysis, retrospective data analysis, analysis on whether or not a particular incident actually can occur in the wider population. And the difficulty here, at least on this side of the pond, is actually how we're going to obtain secondary use data in the context of complying with the European and UK general data protection regulation. And there are ways to manage it because the regulation does not prohibit legitimate use. I think that is how we're going to ensure that the data governance system, taking into account the broader sort of data protection and privacy issues, is a key parameter in managing legitimate use of secondary use data. And it should not be a major barrier to a legitimate use of secondary data to inform, for example, safety analysis or pharmacoepidemiology assessment.
Thanks, Lincoln. And I'll briefly cover some considerations just at a high level at the, in the US. I mean, I think to be clear for everyone listening today, we could spend an hour just talking about any of these topics, right? So, our objective here today is just to give you an overview of some of the legal issues and other issues that come up with these sorts of technologies. But, in the US, just for example, we don't have a general federal data privacy law, but HIPAA is operative. And at the state level, many states have been passing their own privacy laws that would come into play when we're thinking about secondary use of health data. I think the increasingly complicated patchwork of state laws has led to some rumblings that, perhaps a new federal privacy law is in the cards. But right now, all the legislative action, the most meaningful action, happens to be at the state level. Just by way of example, a number of states like California, Virginia, Colorado, Connecticut, Utah have already passed comprehensive data privacy bills. Many more states are considering passage of similar legislation, including bills related to health privacy, automated decision-making. A lot of these laws specifically refer to sensitive types of information, like genetic information. They might be referring to health data related to specific patient populations, like patients with HIV or others. And so the takeaway from the US perspective, right, is you have to be mindful of any HIPAA implications, but also look at the particular state laws that might be operative to make sure that you're not running afoul of any local provisions. Catherine, what's the landscape look like in China?
Yeah, it's actually very similar to Callie, what you just described, but the difference is China has the overarching national privacy law, which was implemented by the government in November of 2021. And the notion of the data privacy law actually is trying to make sure that whenever a data controller processes personal information, it has to be based on a legitimate basis of processing. And actually, China's personal information protection law is closer to GDPR in a sense that it heavily relies on data subjects' consent as the basis of processing. So in the context of secondary uses of health data is regulated as sensitive personal information. And you will probably very likely need to rely on the subject's informed consent in order to use the data for purposes that were described to the patient in the informed consent documents. And the challenge that many companies have been facing right now is you don't necessarily have the ability to exhaustively list all the possible uses of the data in the informed consent form. And many of the health data were collected during the routine practice of medicine. And the primary purpose of allowing processing of the data was to seek healthcare services. All the secondary uses that we could consider were not necessarily captured in the physician or in the hospital's informed consent documents. So there were very limited situations where companies can feel comfortable and flexible using the data for secondary purposes. The Chinese government, on the other hand, is probably the primary beneficiary of secondary uses of health data because the government actually created a lot of data centers in different parts of China with clusters of hospitals, and the hospital actually contribute all raw data to the data centers. The government's goal is trying to use the data for better epidemiology research and potential, I would say, scientific discovery projects. Whether or not the government is willing to allow commercial access and utilization of the data is not very clear yet.
Thanks, Catherine. And Lincoln, I want to come back to you to talk about what's to come. So are there any regulatory initiatives that you're aware of that would encourage or facilitate secondary use of data in the EU?
I think from a EU perspective, I think as I said earlier on, there's a great deal of activity. And one important initiative is really driven by the European network of pharmacovigilance and pharmacoepidemiology. And in recognizing that the number of very rich resources and repertoire of registry established within the European Union and abroad, which can be utilized in various decision making. The registry can be disease, as you know, based or product based registry. And we've seen already very rich data sources looking at specific disease area like ALS, like skin cancer, like Dravet, which is a rare conditions, multiple sclerosis, hemophilia, which is a very well-established registry as a result of all the problems associated with blood products and particularly transmission of infectious agents, and epilepsy, those are very important databases to guide and inform future studies being conducted. We have already seen, for example, real-world examples of utilizing secondary use data and available databases to supplement, for example, single-arm, a study in a gene therapy product approved in Europe for treating very rare condition affecting children, SCID. A single-arm study was approved subject to ongoing collection of data to supplement the existing data set to inform not only the safety, but also the persistency and durability of the response following gene therapy treatment. And also in other area, utilizing advanced therapy and to use existing data registry to support post-authorization commitments.
Yeah, and what about in China, Catherine? I'd be interested in your perspective on what's going on there. And I know you and I have talked in the past about kind of the regulators, shall we say, disinclination or reluctance to allow access to foreign entities when it comes to data collected in China. So would be interested in your perspective on those issues.
Yeah, so you're right, Kelly. I think the Chinese government itself is very keen to explore various ways to use health data, especially big health data. That seems to be a national priority because the government wants to have better sense of epidemiology profile of various diseases and also help physicians and hospitals develop clinical treatment guidelines. But with respect to access of such data by foreign companies, the government has actually enhanced its control over several types of data access scenarios. One is foreign entities are not supposed to collect genetic information, for example. That's considered data that carries national security concerns. So only Chinese entities would be allowed to collect and store genetic information. And for all the hospitals, if they create any medical data or health data during clinical practices, they must store the data onshore in a China-based server. And all the cross-border transfer of such health and medical data, including genetic information, potentially could be subject to the government security review. And if not being subject to the security review, they will also be subject to the execution of standard contractual clauses under the Personal Information Protection Law. So there are a lot of potential hurdles for foreign entities to actually take advantage of the Chinese patients' health data for development and commercialization of their products.
Thanks, Catherine. So let's move on now and talk about our third hot topic, which I think is probably the hottest topic on the agenda today, and that's artificial intelligence and machine learning. And, I think as we all know, this is an area that presents incredible opportunities, but also incredible challenges, not just from a regulatory perspective, but from, with respect to many other issues. And, when we think broadly about the use of AI and ML in the life sciences industry, of course, we're thinking about AI and ML used as a medical device, right? Software as a medical device, for example, for diagnostic purposes and clinical decision support, tools to assess images and scans to make or to help make diagnostic or treatment decisions. Beyond, though, use of AI and ML in the medical device context, it's also becoming increasingly popular to see AI and ML used in other ways. So, for example, in drug development, increasing use of AI for use in drug discovery, for tasks like compound screening and design, also used in the clinical trial context. AI tools can be used to identify or screen patients for clinical trial recruitment, can be used for things like endpoint assessment, can be used for post-market surveillance, can also be used in advanced manufacturing techniques. So really, I think in almost every aspect, AI and ML shows promise in the life sciences area. And I want to spend the rest of our time today talking about some of those regulatory challenges and opportunities and what's on the horizon. So, Catherine, let me start with you. How are AI and ML issues being thought of in China? Are these approaches appropriate from your perspective, and what's to come?
Yeah, so the Chinese government actually started to approach AI and ML in the healthcare context through the announcement of a couple of technical review guidelines involving medical devices using AI and ML as the underlying technology to process health data and also help physicians form disease treatment plans or diagnosis. So those were actually more, I would say, well-spoken frameworks that were developed and put forward by the government. But earlier this year, the government also approached AI and ML more broadly and generically to actually talk about the use of generative AI generally. So in that regulatory guidance, I don't think the government actually intends to really liberalize its control over AI. In fact, in China, it's a very sensitive area, especially if it involves using of AI to shape or influence public opinion. So I think the government in China has taken a more cautious approach. Right now, they would allow the use of AI to develop medical devices software if it's intended for use as a complementary means to help physicians diagnose and treat. But other than that, I didn't really see very clear signals that the government is going to encourage or incentivize the use of AI and ML more broadly in the health space.
Thanks, Catherine. And Lincoln, what about across the pond?
Across the pond here is slightly different, and AI or machine learning equipment can be regulated in two ways. One is subject to essentially a sector-specific vertical legislation as a medical device. If the manufacturer assign a particular medical purpose, you have alluded to treatment, diagnosis, prevention, diseases, etc., then it will be subject to the medical devices regulation. The standard approval very much converging these days to look at the QMS and safety monitoring, etc. And separately, that the AI legislation, which is a horizontal legislation, could come into play because Europe has proposed the world's first comprehensive AI-specific legislation, the AI Act. The Act itself is intended to classify AI systems, not product, by the risk, and the risk classification will regulate the AI accordingly. And there are a number of risk factors already identified in the legislation, and we don't have time to touch on. And the UK tends to take a different approach, particularly post-Brexit, is to take a more decentralized approach, where the individual regulators, for example, the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority, has a responsibility for regulating the use of AI and ML in respect of its utility in a medical context. But obviously, that you mentioned about some of the international collaboration. I think Catherine mentioned about some of the challenges. Internationally, the International Medical Devices Regulatory Forum has also recognized the importance of the development of AI and ML, and the intention is to develop some good practice guidance to provide internationally harmonized principles to help promote development of safe and effective AI and machine learning equipment.
Thanks, Lincoln. And I'll touch briefly on some recent regulatory developments in the US. So in the last few months, we've seen discussion papers come out from FDA about the use of AI in drug development as well as in drug manufacturing. Now, these papers don't have any binding effect. They're not even guidance at this point in time, really just laying out some high-level principles from FDA and asking for stakeholder comment. There have also been a number of public meetings on these topics, and so I think it's safe to say that a proposed framework or guidance is on the horizon. When it comes to AI and ML as incorporated into medical devices, we've seen a number of important regulatory developments in recent years. A few just to note here, in 2021, we saw from FDA an action plan related to AI and ML that focused on 5 priorities, including updating proposed regulatory and guidance frameworks, encouraging harmonization of good machine learning practice development, promoting user transparency and a patient-centered regulatory approach, developing methodology for the evaluation and improvement of ML algorithms, and working with stakeholders who are piloting these sorts of products in the real world to get learning from them. We saw in April of this year a guidance from FDA on what are called predetermined change control plans. Predetermined change control plans are really intended to enable FDA to authorize pre-specified automatic and manual AI ML-based modifications to device software products during the pre-market approval process or pre-market review process, so that companies do not have to resubmit to FDA each time their device is changed as a result of an AI or ML technology. The guidance really just provides an overview of the primary considerations and components that would need to be included in defining the universe of changes to FDA that may be possible. If we look at the guidance agenda for 2024, there are a number of guidance documents related to AI and ML, including issuance of draft guidance on lifecycle management considerations for products incorporating these sorts of technologies, as well as pre-market submission recommendations. So let's talk briefly about some of the key regulatory hurdles when it comes to wholesale adoption of AI and ML technologies. And Lincoln, I'll start with you, because based on our prior discussions, I think that some of the challenges in the EU and the UK are very similar to what we're seeing in the US.
Yeah, very similar. I think the challenges we are facing now is how the AI and ML to clear contextually relevant information for the purpose of modification, continue update of the algorithm to improve the safe and effective use of those innovative systems. So those are the sort of things that being is happening now at a global level.
Thanks, Lincoln. And Catherine, I want to come back to you and talk a little bit about liability considerations with AI and ML. And this is certainly, I think, an emerging area, but one we're starting to get questions about from our clients. So can you describe some general considerations related to liability?
Yeah, no problem. I think actually we first probably need to distinguish whether the AI or machine learning technology is regulated as a product or a service. If it's a product, then we're probably talking the adaptation of general product liability principles. If it's a service, then it's probably negligence or breach of contract. So the traditional torts or contract principles would apply. But I think the key distinction in the AI and machine learning situation is you probably would find it difficult to identify which party is the party that is actually at fault or had negligent in causing the damages suffered by the patients or the users. So whether it's the liability of the software developer or the legal manufacturer, or the platform that hosts the technology, or the healthcare professional that actually uses the technology to treat or diagnose patient. There are multiple stakeholders in the scenario, and it's probably not very easy to identify and assign the liability to a single party.
Thanks, Catherine. I think that's certainly an important area to watch in the US as well as in other
no, not at all.
Oh.
I think in China, they are considered very useful means by the government to address national health issues because the government is taking, I would say, exclusive possession of all the big health databases and data centers formed by the healthcare institutions in China. So in many ways, AI and machine learning is a goal that was encouraged by the government, at least for the healthcare providers, to discover how they can standardize the clinical pathways, how they can actually understand the disease distribution profile of Chinese patient populations more accurately. I think that is actually for the public sector. I don't really see a very clear direction for the private sector to use the ML or AI in advancing public health goals.
And Lincoln, what about you?
I think a similar line of thinking. I think that it can be extremely useful in a single payer system to manage healthcare in terms of drug utilization that will have an impact on the budget management. But also, I think the AI ML can have tremendous potential in the context of precision medicines and particularly precision surgical procedure. We're seeing that being applied. For example, in the UK, in London, a number of clinical centers are essentially coupling the AI and accessory for a precision surgical procedure being conducted rather than essentially to facilitate more precisely keyhole surgery. So it's coming. It's not a theoretical impossibility. It is a possibility.
Great. Well, with that, I see we are at 10:29. So I think it's time to wrap up for the day. Thanks to all who submitted questions. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of them this morning. Thanks very much to my co-panelists, Lincoln and Catherine, for an engaging discussion today. We are all available at ropesgray.com to the extent you have additional questions or if there's anything we can do to help you with your digital health issues. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to our speakers and to everyone that joined us today. Please visit our website at community.hlth.com to catch up on all Health Go Live webinars. And join us in Los Angeles, February 25th through 28th for VIVE 2024.